All right, we're back, and we have a very special guest with us today. Originally hailing from Bethesda, Maryland, his family moves in his youth gave him a pretty broad perspective. He started surfing in Waikiki in 1967, and by 1978, he was California's top-ranked amateur, and then turned pro in the early 80s. In addition to competition, he became one of the world's best traveled surfers with sojourns to Ghana, the Andamans, Mozambique, Scotland, Guam, and elsewhere. A real Renaissance man, in and out of the water, he began writing first for Surfing Magazine and then for Surfer, eventually becoming the editor-in-chief of Surfer Magazine. And he's contributed to storytelling on platforms well outside the surfing world, Outside, Men's Health, PBS, ESPN, and on and on. Today, April 15th, we are celebrating the launch of his latest book, Child of Storms, a surfing memoir in progress. Ladies and gentlemen, we have Sam George with us. Sam, thank you so much for coming on the lineup.
No, this is fantastic. I've sort of envied the people that got your treatment, so to speak. And so it's pretty great to be here now. So I do just want to make one quick correction. The book is coming out April 22nd. Yeah.
Episode's coming out April 15th, my birthday, so it's a real treat for me. But book's coming out April 22nd.
Tax Day too, which is interesting because there's one of the chapters is all about my conflict with the IRS. The chapter is called The United States of America versus Sam George. So it relates to April 15th. One other thing too I wanted to make was that I was the number one ranked WSA men's competitor in 1978. It's funny, I was talking to Matt Warshaw, another former editor of Surfer, just yesterday, and it's funny, we've talked about how as we get older, we get very prickly about not sort of emphasizing any competitive success we ever had. So
I like that. And it's actually like, I think, and this comes up quite a bit in surfing, is that compared to other professional sports, the swagger ceiling is so low and the humility index is so high. And I think it's one of those things too, right? Where it's like, you can have the most talent, you could put in the most work, you can have the best physical fitness, the best equipment, etc. The field of play is so dynamic that I think that the humility is so high, right? Compared to like basketball or football or soccer, you can know you're the best. The field of play is static and you're like, I'm coming out there with quite a lot of swagger. But in surfing, it's the opposite.
Well, only a few surfers in history have the right to have that swagger.
Sure.
There's only a few. I remember one time my good friend, Dave Parmenter, who always gave me tough love during the competitive days, where he was just said, Sam, you got to just admit, you're not as good a surfer as you think you are. And I said, well, Dave, of course I know that. I go, the only surfer in the world that's as good as he thinks he is Tom Carroll. Other than that, we're all doubting ourselves. You know that. Tommy Curran doubted himself, So, I understand that. But it is kind of interesting because, having been involved with surfing for so long, as, of course, an avocation and then later my career and being in the media in a lot of different ways, one of the things that not many people know, and I have to admit, I kind of forgot about it and forget about it sometimes, but I actually had a pretty good competitive career when I was trying my hardest. I did okay. But after that, surfing and other kinds of events, I actually had a really good competitive career. But very few people even know about that. They never, most people don't know about that. And of course, I had 100 competitive mishaps, and like kooky experiences that I'm sure to this day, I mean, you look at the top surfers today, when they come in, they do their interview there, at a WSL event, they might complain about the judging or maybe even an interference call. But very few of them have to complain that the judge's instructions and the contest director's instructions were done in Portuguese with no interpreter. And so somehow I missed my quarterfinal heat, waiting in the water with the rest of the competitors for it to start. So I don't think many surfers today have to deal with that. So
that's pretty funny. I mean, we're coming up on 5 decades of a world tour next year. This is my now 20th year. So in some ways I've been around for a bit, but compared to some of my colleagues, I'm still a baby. And, a lot of the folks that have come to either work with the WSL or interact with it in recent years, they're like, wow, I'll bet it was real Wild West when you started. I'm like, it's all relative. like, yes, it was, but then the generation that came before me, it was, they're building the airplane as it's flying in a lot of ways. And some of the stories are wild.
But, here's something that just to get started here that I would like to say, and I've put this in print before. Having been around, modern, my first surf contest that I watched was the 1967 Makaha International Championships. So I've been around watching contests for a long time. And the point that I was making is that nobody has ever presented competitive surfing better than the current WSL. Nobody. Anyone that tries to hearken back to the good old days, they weren't there for the good old days.
Right.
And they don't know about the good old days. And the whole commenting section in today's sort of online world, as opposed to angry letters to the editor that I've received hundreds of in my time, everyone complains so much. It really is because they have no perspective. Nobody has presented it. Nobody has given the gift of professional surfing to professional surfing fans better than the WSL. Are they perfect? No. But the fact is, they do it better than anyone ever has.
It is a funny thing, too. I think a lot of it has to do with even outside of surfing, humans having to wrestle in the information age, right? Because even before I came to work here, I was like a Rabbit Bartholomew acolyte. I'm like, the Dream Tour sounds amazing. All the exposure I had to it was dusty VHS tapes with highlights or magazine articles with amazing photos. And even that is hyper curated. And in my brain, I'm like, wow, there's never a lull. It's pumping everywhere they go. And then I think now with the information age and webcasts, everyone's just exposed to that. And they're like, bring the Dream Tour back. It's like, this happened back in the Dream Tour too,
Well, wait, let's face it. The Dream Tour is today.
Right.
People that look back and talk about the Dream Tour, come on. I mean, they just lucked out and got some good conditions. How many contests today are held in beach breaks on the World Tour? Every other, two, maybe one, Portugal? Every other contest on the Pro Tour is held at an A+ dream spot. They harken back to the Dream Tour because Rabbit, when he was sort of, running it, he goes, look, let's try to hold these events at world-class spots, not necessarily, Huntington Beach on a Sunday afternoon because you get a lot of crowds there. So they called that the Dream Tour. And yes, it was a big break. No more contests held in, 3-foot beach break in Florida. But, today, virtually every contest on the tour is held at a spot that 99.9% of all surfers would give anything to surf on a good day. And trust me, you cannot predict the surf. You can forecast it, but that's the best you can do. So at every single dream spot, there's the chance that you're not going to get good waves. So I don't mean to rant about it, but every time I hear about bring back the Dream Tour, it's like, are you kidding? And let me make one other point. 99.9% of all surfers in the world, if they could afford it, they would spend all day at a wave pool like Kelly's in Lemoore.
Right. Yeah, it's funny. I think surfers have a little bit of that Mr. Burns in them too, myself included, where it's like, I have it all, but I'd trade it all in for a little more kind of thing. And so, but Sam, I want to talk about your book.
Sure.
Let's jump into it.
I got that rant out of the way.
No. Hey, there will be many more in this podcast. Okay. I'm sure of it. But your book, Child of Storms, a surfing memoir in progress. For our listeners, what is this book about? Why now? And just kind of talk to us a little bit of the process of writing and curating a book like this.
I don't mean to drop names here, but a couple of weeks ago, I was snowboarding with Jerry Lopez, the legendary Jerry Lopez. And I told him that my book was coming out. And he said, oh, wow, what's it all about? And I thought about it for a second. I said, it's all about me. So what is my book about? It's all about me. But I think more accurately, it's all about my perspective of what a surfing life is and what a surfing life means. What I sort of started, I developed this awareness a few years ago where I realized people, when I would tell stories like on a Mentawai boat trip or around a campfire in Baja or a long drive in Baja or, I'd be telling stories and people would always go, Sam, you really should write a book. And then I realized for all the stories that I've written about since 1982 in the magazines and interviews I've done with people and documentary films that I've worked on writing and and also writing and directing, a lot of these stories about my life, my surfing experience, my perspectives, I'd never told them before. And so I started writing them down and I started writing them. And I started looking, I'm going, you know what? There's enough here that might really make an interesting book. And as I started collating not only stories I'd never told, but some of the stories that I'd written over the years that I thought represented my best writing, I started realizing I was winnowing out any of the stories that had been previously published. Because stories that you write for a magazine are completely different than you would write, for example, for a book or a memoir. And so slowly but surely, the stories in the book started to be stories about my experience and the things that shaped me and basically set me on that path that I'm still walking on today. And so I basically started writing more. And my brother Matt published a remarkable book a year and a half ago called In Deep, which was a collection of his 38 years of incredible magazine writing. And at a post-release party we were at, I was telling some stories and, regaling everyone around the campfire, so to speak. And the publisher said, "Hey, Sam, do you have any stories that might be interesting in a book?" And I said, "You know what? I think I do." And that's how it started, to where I started working with this publisher, D'Angelo Publication, a great small kind of boutique publishing company, very passionate about storytelling, very supportive about storytelling. And I started, collating these stories and working with them and putting together what actually is, I think, a pretty good collection. While it's not a memoir in the classic chronological sense, when you get to the end of it, you have a pretty good picture of who I am and what my experiences have been like.
Yeah. And I appreciate you sending over a few of those in advance. I devoured them. And funny enough, I was in San Clemente yesterday and I was having coffee with Jake Howard and he brought you up and I'm like, I'm talking to Sam tomorrow. And he and I, Jake's a little older than I am, but we're really diving into folks like yourself over the course of a cup of coffee because, when I came up and everyone has their own personal journey, but kid from the suburbs, ran away to join the circus because of surfing. And for me, surfing was at the time and through the writings of you and your brother, it really felt like a portal into a very broadening landscape. It wasn't very self-referential. It was surfing's a ticket to learn about different countries and different people and different cultures. And again, from a kid from the burbs, it's God, this is awesome that through this activity and this pursuit, you could really ingest a big chunk of the world. And I really felt like that came across with writers at the time. So we're talking 90s, late 90s, I guess, but you and your brother Matt, of course. And it does feel like your stories are kind of just this mosaic of life. We're getting really deep thoughts about not just surfing, not just the finer points of rail tapering or what a 617 looks like compared to a 67, but broader thoughts. It is, and I don't really have a question. It's more just to dap it up a little bit because I love reading about surfing from that generation because it's not just from that time period. It happened throughout the decades.
Well, yeah, it's really interesting you said that because in the intro, I had to write an intro to the book. And the way I described it is I said that trying to explain or trying to write about something as ephemeral an experience as riding an ocean wave,
right,
and make it relevant to a mainstream reader, it's writing about that aspect of surfing can get tedious,
right?
But writing about a surfing life that contains all the elements of a fascinating, compelling saga, it's got triumphs and tragedies, it has humor. It's got failure, it's got adventure, it's got it all, a surfing life. That can be a fascinating subject to write about, as opposed to writing about surfing. And one of the things I found about when I started looking at the collection of writing I did, I think I only described, in the entire book, I think I only described 3 waves being ridden. No, 4. Okay, 4 waves after 57 years of surfing. I only included descriptions of 4 rides in an entire book. But the story about what encapsulated those 4 rides, what life surrounded it, what circumstances led to them, that was enough to write a whole book about. So that's sort of it. That's the way I sort of looked at it, that, you know, writing about a surfing life can be fascinating. Writing about surfing itself can be tedious reading, even for surfers. It's not easy writing about riding a wave.
No, and not to go English major on anyone, but it's a little bit like the cantos of Ezra Pound, where it's like, I can't actually articulate what I'm giving you here. What I'm trying to do through the cantos is recreate what I felt, right, in a way. And I think surfing is so much like that. Even with the best wordsmiths, they're like, I'm never, ever, ever going to get close to what it was like to ride that wave. Yeah. You know, but as a storyteller yourself, and this being such a personal project, what was the most difficult story for you to include in it, if you had one?
Well, you know, that's working on this book. Okay, and I don't say this in a self-aggrandizing way because it's quantifiable. You know, our sport's greatest archivist and historian, Matt Warshaw, who has basically in his database logged virtually every word that has ever been written about surfing. He goes, you know, Sam, I was looking at it the other day and I realized when you add it all up, you have written more words about surfing than anyone else in surfing history, because you have been doing it for so long without stopping, like without taking long breaks or only writing about one era, okay? So I've written a lot about surfing. But one of the things that surprised me was when I was talking to the editor, and her name's Sequoia at D'Angelo, and one of the author's liaison was telling her, you know, she'd read a few of the examples of this, and they're going, oh, you're going to love these stories. They're great. They're really great. You're going to love them. And the publisher, Sequoia, said, well, that's all great, but here's what I want to know, Sam. What story did you not write? What story did you not put in this book? That's the one that I'm really interested in hearing about. And I thought about it, and the story, I mean, there were a lot, but the one that was the most poignant was the story about the failure of my second marriage. And it involved my wife's breast cancer experience and the experience we went through together with that. My wife, Caroline, you know, I met her in the surf in El Salvador in 1984. We met years later. She'd become an accomplished surfer, and, you know, romance blossomed, and we eventually got married. And, you know, we had this, what most people thought was this dreamy relationship, you know, Sam and Caroline, no bad days ever. But unbeknownst to me, the life we are living, she was an artist and I worked at Surfer as associate editor. It started to become a little limiting for her. She wanted to expand her boundaries outside our little idyllic surfing life. Right. And I didn't see it and I didn't know it. And her going through this cancer experience really kind of crystallized the fact that she was not satisfied or happy in the life we were living. And I'll admit, and maybe I didn't want to admit it for many years, but that I was oblivious to that. That was, you know, a big contribution to the failure of my marriage. And so that was one of those episodes of my life that I'd never really examined fully. And when I told her a very short version of what I just told you, she goes, well, that's got to be in the book. That has to be in the book. Right. And I went, I don't know if I want to write that story. She goes, well, you better. So I did. And it was a really amazing sort of cathartic experience, not shifting any sort of blame off my shoulders for a failed marriage, but actually being able to examine what she was going through, as supportive as I could be and was during her cancer ordeal. The fact of the matter was the life that we had created together, it was no longer satisfying her. And my zealousness and my being completely consumed by my surfing lifestyle, that really contributed to it. And it made me realize that maybe one of the reasons that relationship failed, and that some other of my relationships failed, as they often do, was that try as I might, I never fully made a partner feel that they could ever be as important to me as surfing was. And it's not like I did it consciously. I was pretty conscientious about being a partner, but still there was that tiny little withhold that apparently they never felt completely like they were the most important thing in my life, and they never would be. And so that was a difficult thing to face at my age now, looking back on it and going, wow, no wonder could that have contributed to those other breakups with other women, you know?
Right.
So yeah, that was a tough one.
Well, I mean, in a way, even the way that you write about surfing, which is like has such a broad perspective and is so insightful and is certainly not referential, it feels like you were prepared to write that story anyway. And as you said, like for surfers, every surfer understands how all-encompassing it can be. There's always another board and another trip and another wave, and I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about that, and all of us have to wrestle with that tension that, like, hey, life is on a train track and it's still going, right? Like, and yeah, I mean, Child of Storms, a surfing memoir in progress, is like such a perfect vessel for surfers everywhere to just understand both the obsession and life and get so much out of it. So, man, I'm really appreciative of this book. But real quick for our listeners, just one more time on where and when they can find this book. And then in the next segment, we're going to dive into some few more topics.
Okay. The book is published by D'Angelo Publications, and they can go to D'Angelo, I think it's shopdangelo.com. And they can pre-order the book actually with a discount code #surfstories for a 15% discount. But that's the best way to go to www.shopdangelo.com, and they can order the book. That's a pre-order. It's coming out, like I said, April 23rd. And, it's going to be exciting for me to have these stories out there. I'll just add one last thing is that that was an example that you brought up, and I didn't mean to give you such a long answer.
No, I loved it.
And get really personal right off the bat.
Perfect.
But the point I'm talking about not writing about surfing so much as the surfing life, most of the stories are going to be easily relatable, not only to surfers, but to anyone. Yeah. Like, for example, writing about, as a young person, the debilitating feeling that my dad was disapproving of me, or about my parents' divorce, experiencing, fear and big waves and, things like that. It's in the surfing context, but it's easily relatable to almost anyone, and certainly relatable to surfers, because I'm not the only surfer in the world that's ever had a divorce.
Of course. Well, A Child of Storms, a surfing memoir in progress. Everyone check it out. We'll put a link in the show notes for people to access that as well. We're going to get a quick break to get a word in from our sponsors. And when we come back, we're going to talk some more to Sam.
Fantastic.
All right, welcome back to the lineup. I am Dave Prodan here with Sam George, author of Child of Storms, a surfing memoir in progress. The funny part about this segment of our podcast is typically we like to do the TikTok biography, but I'm not going to kind of like drink the milkshake from your memoir that's coming out. One thing that did come up in that first segment, though, and I thought was such a good point, is that this is such an important text, not just for surfers, but for anybody, because everyone has had these life moments. Everyone's felt, doubt or disapproval from their parents. People have gone through divorces, etc. That said, so few people have been able to, I don't want to say harness, but go through that experience and then for whatever reason, marshal themselves into living a life like you did, learning how to surf, becoming so proficient you became a professional surfer, traveling the world, competing, having all these experiences. Very few people out there are able to blend their personal life and their professional life in a way that they feel impassioned about. And I know a lot of people want to know how and why. I don't expect you to give anyone a blueprint, but can you talk to us just a little bit about that intersectionality of having, like, I am passionately and personally a surfer, and that's also my profession in a lot of ways?
I used to say that the reason why I got so consumed with surfing was partially is because when I began in the late 1960s. But when I moved from Hawaii, my dad was in the Navy. And after 3 years of, getting totally into surfing, we had to move. That was traumatic. We moved to the San Francisco Bay Area, to the East Bay, and it was very difficult to surf. And as a 14-year-old back then, this is before full wetsuits or leashes, surfing in San Francisco wasn't easy. Just getting to the beach wasn't easy. And I had to work really hard at it. And I was the only surfer in my high school. Luckily I found a friend, two brothers that had just started trying to surf. They just started surfing, that summer, and we became friends, and they became, especially my friend Jeff, we became lifelong friends. But it was very difficult. So I had to be really focused and really passionate about wanting to be a surfer. And that was the thing I always told people for years and years and years. It wasn't until I wrote a chapter, and this sounds pretty amazing, but it wasn't until I was in my 60s, and I wrote a chapter in my book about my mother, about my mother and about my parents' divorce, that my best friend, Jimmy Hunter, read that, and he goes, Sam, you read this and it tells you everything you need to know about who you are and why you became who you were, because it is so obvious that during that divorce and the trauma of that family divorce, surfing became your family. It became your community. At that formative age of like 12 to 15, that became your life right there, became identity based. Surfing was a safe place for you to go, hey, I'm not the child of divorced parents. I'm a surfer. I'm not choosing living with my dad over my mom. I'm choosing Hawaii because that's where my dad lives. Mom, right. I'm not choosing him over you. I'm choosing Hawaii over Ohio. Like being a surfer, I like completely immersed myself into that identity. And he said, it's so obvious to see that at that age, the uncertainty that a lot of kids feel during a divorce, where a family breaks up. And my family breakup was ridiculous because basically my parents got divorced without telling us they were going to. Okay, who would do that? But surfing became my identity in such a protective response to that uncertainty that it just carried on from there. That it's all I wanted to do and it's all I wanted to be. And then as time went on, when I started experiencing the whole world of surfing, then it all of a sudden became a magic carpet ride,
Right.
Right. There's another bit in the book, and I don't mean to keep referencing it.
No.
There's another bit in the book where, because I traveled, my dad was in the Navy, and when I was young, we moved to Europe, and we lived in Europe, and we traveled all around Europe, during the early 60s. I sailed there and back on an ocean liner. So as a little kid, I was familiar with adventure, As I started adding adventure surfing to my life, it was just a natural thing. And that brought a whole new spectrum of what a surfer was to me.
Right.
And I kind of wrote about it because I was on a trip on the coast of Ghana in West Africa. And I went there on a bike with a custom made trailer. And I towed my surfboard behind me, and I rode all along the coast there of Ghana, not all of it, but a lot of it, looking to surf waves that, not many people had ever surfed before. And I surfed a few places and I'll stress this, I was the first non-indigenous surfer to ride waves at those places. And I could admit to myself, why did that make me feel so great? Sure, I saw the Endless Summer like everyone else, but you know what? The travel stories in the Endless Summer were fake. They were contrived. They were fake. Okay? You know, in the Endless Summer, why they were surfing in Ghana and they kind of made fun of the African guys that paddling out with one arm, you know, trying to imitate the surfers. You know why they paddled out that way? Because that's the way they paddled out on their boards. They rode belly boards and they paddled them with one arm. Bruce Brown, God love him, he used that as a joke. But the fact of the matter was, they'd been surfing in Ghana for centuries. Okay? So anyway, what I realized, why did I go to Africa and tow my board behind a bike along the coast of Africa all by myself? Why? Because I had this deep-seated belief that being a surfer was an exceptional state of being. It was an exceptional way to live your life. And by proving that with, you could call it an experience or you could call it a stunt, by proving it with doing things like that, it made me think, okay, in that case, I'm exceptional. Maybe that's what I wanted. Maybe I wanted to always prove somehow that I was exceptional. So I was doing these exceptional things, even living the whole, all-consuming surfing life. And that's one of those revelations and those sort of self-examinations that you can't have until you're older, until you've been on the path for many more years. That, why do I like doing this? Why did I like surfing places where they had never seen a surfer before? As opposed to being the hottest guy out at Lowers. Right. Not that I was the hottest guy out at Lowers, but I was one of the better guys. But the point was that I truly believe, with no cynicism, that being a surfer is an exceptional state of being. It's an exceptional thing to dedicate yourself to, and it's an exceptional passion to have. All these years of doing it has not diminished that feeling whatsoever.
I think most of our listeners, if not every single one of them, would agree. They probably don't articulate it exactly as you did there, because that's pretty poetic. Let me just say one thing. Yeah. You don't have to go to the extremes that I've gone. You don't have to move to Easter Island and live with an island girl to prove how exceptional surfing is. You can do it by going down to the end of your street and loving surfing. You can do it with sharing surfing with your kids. You could do it by saying, hey, no, you go on this next wave. Those are all ways to experience what an exceptional state of being surfing is. Sharing it really is the gift. Yeah. That's the gift that surfing gives you, that you can share it. So I'm not saying you have to ride 60-foot waves or go on, bike trips with your board on the coast of West Africa. You can do it at the end of your street. Yeah. It's similar. I always kind of paraphrase like the Dane Reynolds definition of a kook as well. He's like, a kook's got nothing to do with your ability. It has everything to do with self-awareness. Like, that's a great statement. He's like, I know people who are beginners who understand they're beginners. Those people are not kooks. He's like, I also know surfers who are pretty technically good, who think they're way better than they are. Those people are kooks. And I'm like, I'm gonna use that forever. No. Bravo for Dane. That's a really good way of putting it. Once again, right? So much of what you said resonates. I think just in how magical it is, how special it is, how profound it is to live life as a surfer. And I think what we see throughout, the professional side of surfing, not just like pro surfers, but journalists and magazine editors and filmmakers and industry, bigwigs, et cetera, is there's so much self-actualization from individuals because of that passion. We're coming up on 50 years here of a global tour. And, I have the benefit of working with a lot of those founding members, whether it's a Randy Rarick or Fred Hemmings or Wayne Bartholomew, Mark Richards, et cetera. And so much of the story at the time, right, was we feel like we're doing something really special. We're going to turn our passion for it into a career. We're going to manifest a world tour. And you see that so often. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that. And if you agree to it, what kind of experiences you've had, because even being a professional surfer in the 80s, as we said, pretty Wild West, pretty choose your own adventure. The path you cleaved in writing about surfing and publishing about surfing, a lot of that had never been done before as well. So I'm wondering if you can speak to that a little bit.
Well, yeah, that is sort of interesting, because sometimes I wonder what influences drove me not just to want to figure out a way to pay my rent by surfing, but to want to share my perspectives and want to help other people share their perspectives. Because, like I said, I was writing for the magazines and websites pretty much nonstop since 1982.
Mm-hmm.
That's not most of that time really is spent helping others share their perspectives. Like a lot of the stories, I've written a lot of first-person stories, but usually all of them have some sort of relatable theme. But so many more are me interviewing people, writing about people, or helping people share their perspectives, especially when you get into the realm of documentary film. That's your whole job, is to get those interview subjects
right
to accurately share their perspective. I look around at some of the friends that I used to live in the Burley Heads caravan park, 4 of us sharing a tiny little trailer, wanting to be pro surfers, like Willie Morris and Mark Price, and the guys that, so many of the guys that I used to surf with like that on the in those early days on the tour, and then I went to work for the magazines eventually. Most of them went into the surfwear market, and most of them made a lot of money.
Right.
And sometimes I wonder, why didn't I go into the surfwear market? Why did I sit down at a desk in Surfing Magazine in January of 1985 and just go, hey guys, anything I can do? Because I'd been corresponding,
Sure.
before that. But, I finally went into the office because my sponsor dropped my brother and I. It was like, guys, the party's over. It was a good run, but the party's over. I needed a job. I went in the magazine, just said, hey guys, anything I could do? They go, yeah, help us out with this. And I never got up from that desk. And I wonder, well, why did I do that? And why didn't I go to work for Quicksilver?
Right.
But for me, I think the difference was that I wanted to share my perspective, and I wanted to help other people share their perspectives. And I had my whole rich surfing life the whole time. Even though those guys that made a lot of money and they got to go to Tavarua a lot, they had to work. Right. For all the years I worked at the magazines, I never once, when a single day, felt like I was going to work. And I was living my own surfing life at the time. Like, for example, at both magazines, I made an arrangement where I took less salary, but I made sure that I got 2-week surf trips every season, just for myself.
Sure.
Aside from traveling and covering the sport.
Right.
But so it was that sort of manifested surfing life that suited me and suited my sort of vision of what my surfing life could be like. And a lot of my friends, like I said, they made a lot of money. They bought homes. They bought new cars. They bought cars that they knew would get them back from Big Sur. Whereas for me, every time I went up there, it was a gamble.
There it goes.
So that's what it was for me, was just, I found great satisfaction in writing those articles. And also great satisfaction in helping other people share their perspectives. And it just kept going and kept going and kept going. And next thing I knew, I turned around and went, wow, I've been doing this for many years.
I'm curious, that instinct to share your stories and support other people sharing their stories, is that something that you were well aware of at the time, where I'm like, I am driven by this, and like you're articulating it to yourself? Or was it more instinctual, and upon reflection, you're like, I ended up where I was supposed to be. It never would have worked for me if I'd tried to do something else?
That's a good question, because I did never think about it really, in the early days. I really didn't think about it. I was just doing it. However, I was always, because my father was an inveterate reader, and my mother was an elementary school teacher, and my dad was a great storyteller, as was my mom, and they encouraged us both to read and to write down our stories, both me and Matt, and so I became that sort of reader, and I was always really good at writing. It was the only skill reading and writing was the only academic skill I had. That was it for me. I mean, math, science, I was terrible in those subjects. So I already had that ability to put words down together. And at least I had a feel for story, because, we love telling stories, there's a pacing, there's a structure of storytelling, verbal storytelling. Because let's face it, Homer didn't write down the Odyssey. He spoke it aloud around fires,
Right.
So there's a pattern and a template for telling a good story. And if you get a feel for it, even as a kid, if you're a good kid storyteller, you're going to be a good adult storyteller. And so I had an affinity for it. And so I think that I did kind of get satisfaction out of doing it and becoming that figure in the surfing world. But it was almost like I never thought that I would ever do anything else. Like it never occurred. I couldn't shape. That was horrible. My dad and I shaped my board in 1970 because I wanted to be part of the shortboard revolution. We shaped a 6.6 minigun in our basement in Halava Heights. It was awful, but I loved that board. But it was horrible. I couldn't shape. I couldn't even glass. I was a horrible ding repairman. And I worked at surf shops for a number of years. I was a good surf shop employee. But, so writing about surfing seemed to me, wow, this is great. If I can keep this going, it's the perfect combination of what, sort of who I am. Once again, my friend Jimmy, he said one time, he goes, Sam, you're so lucky. What you do is who you are. And I thought, you know what? Then I'm a success, even if I make 1/10 the amount of money every year that my friends did that went to work for Gotcha.
It's a great insight. I mean, one of the things too, like we're all products of our environment. You've given us a few kernels of, your mom, dad, like brother, like how that's formed who you are, but also geographically. And, I want to hear any thoughts you have just around like you being on the Central Coast, you being in Santa Barbara in that time period, like 70s, 80s, and just the community, the culture, the waves, like geographically, how that may have like informed your perspective as a writer and a storyteller compared to, if you'd grown up in the surf industry of Orange County or somewhere else, right?
Sure. Well, it's interesting. Two people were hugely influential in my life. I mean, there are a number of them, but two of them were my friend Jeff Chamberlain, he was 1 year older than me, but he started learning surfing the same year I moved to the Bay Area. He, right from the start, surfing was an adventure for him. He was one of those guys that was not satisfied with just surfing the regular spot. He always wanted to look up around the corner, up around the point, and he instilled that in me because he had a driver's license. So I followed along with him. He was never satisfied. It was always searching for that other experience. The other was Dave Parmenter, the incredibly talented but rather eccentric professional surfer, shaper, and writer. Because the thing was, when I graduated from high school, my grades were so bad that no college would take me. I couldn't get admitted to college. I had a very nice high school counselor, very dedicated. She called every California state college and said, look, I've got this guy. He's really bright. He's really good writer. He's worked great on the school newspaper. Yeah, his grades aren't that great, but I think you would like him. Could you let him into your journalism school? Only one school responded, and that was Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. They had a small journalism department. I wanted to go to San Diego State and get sponsored by GNS and surf La Jolla shores. Okay? I just wanted to get as far away from Ocean Beach break as I could. All I wanted to do was ride for GNS and live and surf La Jolla shores. Nothing could have been better for me than going to San Luis Obispo. My friend Jeff had gone there the year before. He was also a journalism major. And what happened there was that I was forced to live an outback surfing experience just by nature of the Central Coast. And my friend Jeff, who was never satisfied with going just to the, to go to Morro Rock and surf, he wanted to go up and search big surfer spots, things like that. And so that experience, even as frustrated as I was, not living where surfing was happening, Santa Barbara, Rincon, even the South Bay and San Diego and Trestles and all that. I wanted to be there because I wanted to be in the midst of it. Instead, just by circumstances, I was living up on this wild Central Coast to where, there were a lot of times when we'd go surfing, we'd never see another surfer, And the waves were really hard to find and really hard to predict. Like Dave Parmenter used to say, it's like a Rubik's Cube trying to figure out the conditions. But it really instilled that essence of that surfing is an adventure. When Dave Parmenter and his mom and his brother John moved up there in like 1976, 77, Dave went even further down that road. To him, if anyone else was out, he wouldn't go out. He surfed all these weird reef breaks, and even as a young guy, or days where no one else would go out. And he really also instilled in me that feeling that we should be grateful, because he came from Newport Beach, and he instilled that feeling that we should be grateful because we can make our surfing life up here whatever we want it to be. We can do whatever we want. Now, the fact that we both drifted into professional surfing, okay, so we wanted a little bit more than what the Central Coast could offer us. But those two guys really helped me appreciate how influential spending those 6 or 7 years on the Central Coast were in my development. However, I have to admit, I just lusted after point breaks. All I wanted to do was surf Burley Heads in Australia. J Bay that was too much of a faraway dream. I didn't think that could ever happen. But just get me to Burley Heads. That's all I want. And so eventually, when the opportunity popped up for me I was working at a surf shop in San Luis Obispo, to move to Santa Barbara and go to work for their sister shop in Santa Barbara. I jumped on it. And then Rincon and the Rincon parking lot became my universe for some time.
Awesome. We're going to take one more quick break to get a word in from our sponsors. And when we come up, we're going to wrap it up with the one and only Sam George. Welcome back to the lineup. I am Dave Prodan here with the one and only Sam George. We've been talking about his newest memoir, Trial to Storms, a surfing memoir in progress. I don't know if this made it into the recording or if it was us talking before, but, I mentioned, the current editor-in-chief at Surfing Magazine, Jake Howard. He and I had coffee yesterday, and he said that he'd spoken to you recently, and he mentioned that you're up in the Pacific Northwest. And I'm like, well, Warsaw's up there, and Drew Campion, are they all like in the same area? Because it feels like any dedicated core surfer that wants to kind of climb up the Temple Mount to learn from the elder gods. It's nice if you guys are all in the same zip code. What's going on with that?
No, it is. It's pretty uncanny that that's how it turned out. Well, for me, Drew moved up here many years ago. Drew was the really influential editor of Surfer Magazine during what we call the transition period from longboards to shortboards. Hugely influential, and then longtime surf journalist after that. He moved up here, 25 years ago, because when you really think about it, if you lived the California surfing life in the 60s and even into the 70s, when it started getting, as the years went by, and the surf culture changed and it got more crowded and, all those different elements, where would you go? Where would you go? Whidbey Island, which is about 40 miles north of Seattle, 40 miles north of Seattle, is this beautiful island right at the sort of terminus of the Strait of Juan de Fuca in what's called the Salish Sea. It's a beautiful island, like a lot of the islands up here, the San Juan Islands. So Drew moved up here to this, what I call the Laguna Beach of the Pacific Northwest. It's a picturesque town called Langley. Matt, after sort of tempering his obsession with surfing Ocean Beach, He moved up here with his wife, who took a job up here, a really good job. And Matt decided, you know what? I'm going to move up here and I'm going to help raise our son. And I'm going to transition my life up here, a whole different experience. And that was years ago. And some people actually gave him a lot of guff for that, just going, oh, how can you quit surfing every day? What do you, how dare they ask Matt Warshaw if somehow he was like, ye of little faith?
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, how dare you say that to Matt Warshaw of all people? For heaven's sakes, Matt Warshaw in the first OP Pro in an early heat beat Tommy Curran.
Right.
Little known fact, okay, so Dale Dobson, placed first, Matt got second of the heat, but Tom Curran got third. So how dare you question his faith? For me, what led to my move up here was I had been living in West Malibu, the area called Point Dume, for about the last 18, 19 years. Point Dume is what I call a semi-private surfing area. The access is limited. Back in the 70s, the localism was really bad, and that reputation carried on. It's really hard to get to. You have to, before you couldn't even walk from the highway, but eventually you could walk from the highway. But the result was there's good waves there, and it's not very crowded. And the locals there now will hate me for saying that, but it's just that's the way it was. So that period of my life of surfing good, relatively uncrowded waves, and at the same time with my friend Jeff Chamberlain, who was sort of the admiral of the west end of the ranch boat flotilla. We started, even though I've been surfing the ranch, the Hollister Ranch and the Bixby Ranch. I first started surfing there in 75, but I started boating in with Jeff in earnest for almost that same time, for about 20 years. And we only surfed the west end because Jeff would always say, if there's a parking lot in front of it, it's not a surf spot. So, any spot on the ranch where you could drive your car and park on the beach, we avoided those breaks. In his boat, we would go up and surf by Point Conception. So that's 20 years of surfing good waves, uncrowded, getting vastly more waves than you ever would have in sort of a more, let's say, prosaic surfing life.
Right.
I started getting this feeling that I needed less and less. Big pumping south swell. I would go out and catch 3 set waves in 40 minutes, 20 minutes, and then I'd come in and I'd cheer on my friends or take their kids out in the whitewater or something. That's all I needed. I realized I'm needing less because after all these years, I've had so much and been fortunate enough to have so much. I mean, I've surfed. My brother asked me a while back, he goes, hey, do you think you'd count up all the surf spots you'd ever surfed? And I thought, well, that's interesting. So I embarked on the exercise. 695 distinct surf spots in 42 different countries. I've surfed a lot of waves, and so I was getting this feeling, wow, I don't need it as much. And then I was sort of conflicted thinking, wow, is there something wrong with me? What's happening? Am I losing my faith? And then I started realizing, wait, no, and then once again, one of my best friends, I talked to him about this feeling I was having, like, why am I surfing less and less, but enjoying it just as much? And he said, you know what it is, Sam? He goes, after all this time and all the commitment you put into this lifestyle, he goes, your identity project is complete. You've become the person that you always wanted to be. From that kid that started in 1967 in Hawaii, you finally become that guy you always wanted to be. Now you're free to do whatever you want. If you want to go surfing, you can surf. If you don't feel like surfing, you don't have to. And there was this feeling of almost relief of just going, wow, that's a really interesting concept, because so many surfers, their surfing life is basically, it's steeped in anguish. It's steeped in expectation, denied. It's steeped in the feeling I've never gotten enough.
Right.
But I realized I may have gotten enough to where now I can just, if I want to surf, I can surf. At the same time, my girlfriend, Cammie, her mom had died a few years ago, and her father was experiencing the early signs of dementia. And we decided together that we were going to move in with him for this period, and live up there and take care of him while we could, while we still could, and be with him. Now, it didn't hurt that he lived in this beautiful 4-bedroom house on an acre overlooking the water, about 3 miles from the island's only surf spot. That didn't hurt, but it mostly was a decision that, you know what, I've gotten to a point in my life where I've kind of had enough. And that doesn't mean I'm turning my back on it. It just means that I'm free. I'm free to surf when I want. We went up to Vancouver Island and surfed up there a little while back. It was great. We had a great time, and I live right on the water. I paddle my stand-up paddleboard. I paddle my outrigger. I have this whole different relationship with the ocean that is so liberating. I told my brother, Matt, I go, Matt, you know what I'm experiencing? I mean, I went from being able to surf every day uncrowded waves in my golf cart, okay, to, bringing my outrigger down and paddling out into the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And I said, and you know what I'm experiencing for the first time almost in my adult life? I can look at the ocean. I can appreciate all the splendor and majesty of the ocean without placing any of my own personal demands on it. Every single day, most surfers look at the ocean and they go, why not? Why not? Come on, man. No, what I experienced up here is I can look at the ocean now and just appreciate its beauty, appreciate all its different moods without my desires clouding that experience. Now, does that mean I don't like to surf? No, I love to surf. But my surfing life has become way more personal. And in a way, that's what if we had never moved up here and left, Paradise Cove in Malibu, if I had never moved up here, I might have never discovered that. I may have become jaded. I may have become, the whole concept of having enough, it would have taken on a whole different meaning, like, man, I've had enough. Think about the different ways, just the inflection. I've had enough, as opposed to, man, I've had enough. So, yeah, I would have never discovered it had I not moved up here and been close to Matt Warshaw.
That's it. So we just all need Matt to kind of level us out.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I think that's such a perfect illustration of what comes through in the memoir, right? Because it is about like, what is the balance, and I think that's something that any surfer, any non-surfer can appreciate as well. And, Ryan Callanan, he's a CT surfer. He's from Newcastle. He's one of my favorite surfers, wise beyond his years. And he really articulated this once to me really well. He's like, surfing is so fun, it's impossible to say no to most of the time. It's like you always want to get another wave. You always want to have another session. You always want to say yes to another trip. And he was talking about in the context of letting his body heal, where he's like, it's really hard to say no to. And I think all surfers can kind of appreciate that. But then sometimes like life just gets in the way. It's, fatherhood and career and this and that. And just, it's like I'm being forced to balance this out. But almost to a person, their relationship with surfing's gotten so much better. In a lot of ways, they're going, I surf better now that I only surf once every 2 weeks instead of every day. There's sort of the Vietnam POWs that go in, with a certain golf handicap and they don't play at all, but that's all they think about. And then they come out and they're better golfers. There's that. Yeah. But then there's also just like, hey, I just have a healthier relationship to it. So I think that's an amazing illustration of kind of the whole project in a way.
Yeah, no, it's that's true. It's really interesting that you sort of picked up on that, because a lot of the self-awareness that I'm experiencing right now, I couldn't have experienced it back when I was so driven, that I was so driven, I mean, I was so driven once. I came home. I was married at the time. I came home from a weeks-long trip through Australia to cover the Pro Tour. Went to Fiji on the way home. Didn't go to Tavarua, surfed this other wave on the Coral Coast. All by myself, the only guy there. Surfing these barrels on this reef. On the way home from the airport to Santa Barbara, at midnight, I noticed waves splashing up onto the highway, and I realized, wow, Rincon's pumping right now. With my car loaded, I pulled into the parking lot, got my board out, ran down, paddled out at midnight to surf Rincon. on my way home from the airport, coming home from Australia and Fiji. You know, I mean, you want to talk about driven, you know, I was driven, you know, and I may not have been able to reach this state of self-awareness back then because of that drive, you know, because of what the person I wanted to be. I wanted to be that guy, you know, and like my friend said, hey, your identity project, it's complete. You're who you wanted to be.
I told you that like that zip code up there is like, you know, moving up to the Shangri-La steps. We're going to understand more about ourselves. I'm going to make the pilgrimage, but it is funny. And I do think it's like, it's maturation and it's life and experience. I remember vividly, like, you know, Nat Young's voiceover when Shelter came out, you know, and he's older and he's like talking about, you know, I need less waves. It takes me less waves to make this happy. And as like a 20-year-old, you're like, that's fucking crazy. Like, what's he talking about? And then, I mean, I at different levels, of course, like I can appreciate that so much more now at 41 and it feels real good. So
and I was in my 30s when I paddled out a week on a night. You know, right. God, Recon's breaking. I'm out there.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, the book is called A Child of Storms, a surfing memoir in progress. Sam George, we will let everyone know how to get it in the show notes. It's been fantastic talking to you. Before you go, we've got one last segment. It's called the lightning round.
Okay.
So these are 10 questions for you to answer as quickly as you can.
Okay. And I'm a little nervous right now.
You should be.
This is like a WSA men's heat. 15 minutes, best 3 waves.
That's right. Beach start.
Yeah.
If you could only have one board setup for the rest of your life, single fin, twin fin, thruster, quad, bonzer, or finless, which would you choose?
Quad.
Coffee or tea?
Don't drink any either.
Burrito or pizza?
Burrito.
Last book you read?
Last book I read, it was called, oh my gosh, it was, I'm picturing the book. It was a wonderful biography on Captain Cook, the most recent one.
Okay. Best surf film ever?
Best surf film ever? That's a tricky question, but when I'm going to have to say the original 5 Summer Stories. The original, not the ones that came years later.
Sure. If you only, one wave you never have to go back to.
One wave I never have to go back to, Jeffreys Bay, South Africa, Super Tubes. Because I've experienced it, me and Dave Parmenter out by ourselves.
That's a high bar.
Sorry, I didn't mean to amend it there.
No, I like that. Yeah. If you only get to surf one wave the rest of your life, and you can dreamcast it, perfect conditions, just you and your friends, which wave would that be?
Waikiki, canoes.
Okay. Best person to share a lineup with?
I'm going to say my girlfriend, Cammie.
Worst person to share a lineup with?
My dear, dear friend, Jerry Lopez.
Okay. Last one. Finish this sentence. I will next achieve a state of happiness by?
Getting a new board.
I love it. Sam George, a personal privilege and honor to get to speak to you. I've been such a fan for such a long time. This has been a real treat. It could have been 15 hours long pretty easily. Everyone check out Sam's new memoir. Comes out on April 22nd. We will put the link in the show notes. It is A Child of Storms, a surfing memoir in progress. Thank you so much, Sam.
No, I appreciate it. This has been really fun. And it's, you know, I will say one of the things I do miss up here is surf talk. And talking to someone that's so knowledgeable and has that kind of perspective, it's really been a treat for me. So
I'm coming up there. We'll hold a forum. I'm just gonna learn from the elders there.
And that's coming from a silverback like myself, looking back at a youngster and looking towards a youngster like you. So
it's all relative. I appreciate that.
Thanks a lot. It was great.